On with session 4, so I'll invite all the group. So this is a highly anticipated session showcasing the work of a significant initiative we launched in 2024, the first Canadian Multimodal Comparison Forum. So to chair this session, I'm delighted to welcome our very own Dr. Madeleine McPherson. So Madeleine served as the co-scientific director of the EMH and is assistant professor at the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Victoria, where she leads the Sustainable Energy System Integration and Transition SISIT group. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Madeleine and her panelists for this session.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, perfect. Okay, yeah, let's get all of the panelists up. If we can. Okay, yeah, I think we're ready for the slides. Who are we missing? Pam. Pam and Michelle. Okay, we can get started, but if anybody sees Cam or Michelle. So good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to be presenting in this session on the multi-model comparison forum that the EMH launched just about a year ago. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview just about the sort of multi-model comparison forum so far. And then our panel is really going to be diving into the specific results just from one of the working groups focused on the electricity system. So the EMH established the multimodal comparison series together with ECCC at the start of 2024, building off of some of the experience that this community had both with the Stanford Modeling Forum in the US and also the Integrated Assessment Modeling Consortium, primarily in Europe. And so our aim with this forum was sort of to take some of the learnings from both of those sort of parallel initiatives, but really focus on the Canadian landscape of energy systems models and pathways. So our overarching objective was to facilitate an open comparison of model results and methodologies, and to try to sort of foster a more collaborative environment amongst the modelers. And then more specifically dive into some of the dynamics that are driving some of the differences that we're seeing in the results, try to enhance our sort of mutual understanding of between modelers and policymakers and between our models themselves. Importantly, identify any gaps, specifically around data that might be really important for improving and sort of coming up with best practices. We spent a lot of time, I'd say the majority of the time over the last 2 sessions, really coming up with standardized workflows, so common inputs, scenario bundles, visualizations. Okay, great, we've got everybody. And then finally, visualizing some results and model differences. So we started, in about February of this year, just with sort of some kickoff discussions. And then we had our first forum actually in June in Toronto. So we had over 30 modeling teams from across Canada there in Toronto, broken up into one of 3 working groups. So the working group 1 is the electricity system modeling group. So those are these folks you can see here on the panel. Working group 2 was more energy systems models. And then working group 3 was more sort of on the demand side sectoral models. So building and transportation primarily. One of the key outcomes from working group 2, who don't have a panel, but was the launch of 4 research projects specifically focused on hydrogen, biofuels and bioenergy, nuclear and SMRs, and DACs and CCR. So then we had our second model comparison forum just yesterday here in Ottawa. And in January, we'll be doing a new call for applications if there's any other groups who are interested in joining any one of the 3 working groups. So stay tuned for that. So this panel today, we're going to focus mostly on that working group 1, which is the electricity system models. And our key objective really in both forums that we've had so far is really to try to align as much as we can on inputs, so that we can get good sense of the underlying factors that are really driving differences between our results. And that's not to say that we necessarily agree on all of the inputs. That's just to say we're going to use a common set of inputs so that the inputs or uncertainty in the inputs are not as much as possible driving the differences. So we've been relying a lot on coders to do that. And Maddie's got a really good slide describing exactly where we are and are not aligned on using coders data. So I won't go over that, but I did just want to mention that the EMH just launched a new version of coders very recently that now includes 4 key improvements that might be relevant for some folks in the room who are already using coders or who might be thinking about using coders. And Rick will be giving a more fulsome presentation on coders later in the forum. But those 4 key improvements are now we do have a portion of coders that's fully open access, so there's no requirement to agree to anything to access that data. Those are tables that legally we're allowed to just fully open access. Then the other portion of the data that does still require permission to access, it's a little bit easier to get that access. So you don't have to send us an email, and there's just a click wrap to get access to that. So it's a little bit more straightforward. We've also added the ability to preview data in the database in a little bit more accessible way. And we've made it a little bit easier to download CSV files. So all of those things to sort of look forward to if you're using coders or if you want to use coders. But don't worry, if you already have workflows established using coders, we have done our best to not break any of those workflows. And of course, get in touch with us if we have. So that's sort of one key piece of software that we really needed in order to do this multi-model comparison. And the second one is using the idea visualization platform. So the results that the panelists will be presenting today are using that visualization platform. And so this is the second time that Working Group 1 is using that platform. And so we have the workflow a little bit more established this time, enough that all of the results were sort of contributed to the database a few weeks in advance of when we actually met in person here, so that we could sort of poke around looking at each other's results before to really seed the discussion that we would have here. And we'll be hearing more from Jonas and Devin tomorrow on some more updates from the IDEA platform. So with that, I'll just launch into the panel. We're going to start with Maddie giving an introduction, an overview of all of the models that we used in this multi-model comparison forum. And we sort of tried to challenge ourselves as a panel this time. None of us are presenting on our models alone. It's all of the presentations you'll see are comparisons of so each of these are modelers who are responsible for one of the models, but are presenting on the model comparison. So all 6 models. So just keep that in mind. If there's very specific model questions that you have, they should go to the actual modeler, not necessarily the person who presented the results. So this is us trying to act more as a community and understand each other's results more. So so we'll start with an overview, and then we'll have a bit of a review. We ran 4 scenarios as a group. So net zero and CER is 2 policy scenarios compared to a no policy. And then the impact of transmission. So sort of a 2x2 matrix there for a total of 4 scenarios. And then we'll dive into 2 pieces of input or 2 modeling frameworks that are different among all of us that seem to drive some of the differences in our results. So Cam will present a little bit on how each of us are characterizing renewable energy resources in our model. And then Pascal will be talking about how our different approaches to representing trade with the US in our model. And then finally, Michelle will do a little bit of a wrap up for us. So we'll start with Maddie. Maddie is a research analyst at the CESIC group at UVic. She has expertise in developing model linkages. So she's currently leading up the model linkages for CESIC's Open Insights project. which is being showcased in the next room if you're interested in that. Maddie has a lot of experience with a number of different energy systems models and linking them up. So production cost modeling as well as capacity expansion modeling on the supply side, but also some experience with demand side models. So Maddie, over to you.
Oh, I think I've broken it. Okay, thanks, Madeline. Hi, everyone. So, as mentioned, I'm going to just introduce the models that were used within this multi-model comparison forum. And just to quickly revisit the purpose, we really wanted to align on scenario inputs, as mentioned by Madeline, but we really didn't want to just all be working with the same model or to over-align or to lose some of the heterogeneity of this modeling community and or overlook any assumptions that were made specifically based on specific groups' perspectives. So yeah, so in summary, align on inputs, but maintain the assumptions and the architecture of the models where possible. As mentioned, this was for the purpose of identifying key inputs and assumption decisions that would cause significant divergence or convergence between the model results and learn from those so we can decide as a modeling community or as individual groups where that's important for us to improve our models or where specific modeling decisions, even if it causes divergence, were maybe important for the purpose of the model that we constructed. And then finally, as mentioned, increase the knowledge of other modeling methodologies within the Canadian modeling landscape and the Canadian modeling community so that we can all be better modelers and increase the value of our models individually and as a community. So the purpose of this section is to introduce the models that were used within this comparison. So ideally, we'll provide a bit of a baseline that you guys can consider as we look towards the results and potentially explain where models were similar or different and why that was the case. So there were 5 models or 5 modeling groups and models that are being showcased today. ESMIA used the NATEM Canada model, HEC Montreal used Pithos, Natural Resources Canada used PIPSA Canada, CESIT used the copper model, and then Setubra used the Tomoa model. So just a quick overview of the specifications of each of the models. For the most part, these models were very similar, especially compared to the working group 2 that was energy system models. There was much more closer alignment in the specifications of our models that we used. So they were all capacity expansion models, and they all have a similar methodology, as in it's a type of economic optimization that was used to create the results that are seen today. So this obviously with optimization models is representing a optimal system flow and isn't necessarily considering human nature within the results or the inputs. Where there was some difference in the models is in the availability. So all these models were built on open source or available model bases, though they were calibrated and the versions seen here today are not necessarily open source themselves. So NATEM and PIPSA Canada, I should say PIPSA Canada, were built on proprietary data versus Pithos, Copper, and Tomoa are all open source model and data. The scope and resolution of the models, again, for the most part, was very similar. So again, they all represented just the power sector and represented the electricity system. Spatially, they all represented the entirety of Canada, though some, or NATEM, I suppose, included the territories, while the others were just focused on the 10 provinces. And the resolution, again, was pretty similar. Roughly, each province was represented by 1 node, with a few exceptions. So within a capacity expansion models, there are 2 temporal aspects. So there's a dispatch aspect, which is, a planning aspect, which is where we see where the snapshots of the electricity system are taken. And all the models were aligned on providing those snapshots at 5-year increments. But where we were seeing some difference was in the dispatch aspect. So NATEM and Copper were both models that used representative days or representative time slices to inspect the operations of the electricity system that were being proposed versus Pithos PIPSA and TOMOA were running dispatch hourly for an entire year, so at much higher space or temporal resolution. So this was the slide that Madeline teased before, but this is looking at the input and assumption sources of all the models. As mentioned, we were trying to align as much as possible to use data from the coders database, as there's quite a bit of power system data there. And that's represented by green in this table. Blue is where there were where models weren't necessarily able to align by using coders data, either due to data availability, the type of data needed, or it could not be decoupled from their model. But there are these two purple squares, which illustrates in a way how difficult this input alignment can be, because these were models that actually represented inputs that were exogenous for other models as endogenous optimization parameters, just illustrating that it's not as clear-cut as just plugging in different numbers, and sometimes model architecture can really get in the way of model alignment. I would like to reiterate, though, we were pretty pleased with the amount of alignment we were able to get. Even, for example, if you look at a row like technology parameters that has two blue squares, maybe you would say, oh, it's not that aligned. When you dig into it, there was actually more alignment than can be seen, and this is across all the different input categories. So there were specific areas that weren't able to be aligned, but all in all, we were pretty pleased with the alignment, and I'm going to keep saying the word alignment, I'm sorry, between the models. However, there were still some areas that we really believe can further be improved, but may present some difficulties. For example, system parameters. Certain models, such as Native and Pithos, didn't use the same system parameters as inputs for their models, so we weren't able to align there. And then PIPSA and TOMOA had much harder time decoupling their inputs from their model assumptions, meaning that this is one area where there actually wasn't a lot of alignment between the models, and maybe will explain some of the differences in the outputs. Finally, and again, to reiterate potentially the difficulty of this task and why we feel we've done a pretty good job considering, this column or this row of VRE capacity factors you may look at and say, oh, there's a lot of alignment between the inputs. However, and as Cam will discuss later on in the panel, even though the input sources are the same, the spatiotemporal representation of VRE between the models vary drastically, meaning that despite the alignment of input and input sources, this is, we actually found, was one of the largest areas of discrepancy in the models and led to significant divergence in results. So just in wrap up, we are pretty pleased with the alignment between scope, resolution, and overall inputs, harmonization between the different models. And as mentioned, the difference in model inputs is likely what will directly contribute to the differences in the modeling results that we're going to show you. And the two key areas of difference in the model results, which will be talked about further, are the difference in VRE capacity factor characterization, as well as international trade representation. So this, if these factors will be important to keep in mind as we go through the model results. So I'm going to pass it back to Madeline to continue on with the panel.
Okay, thank you, Maddie. So next up, we have Stephen from Enercan CanMet, where he's been since 2014. At CanMet, Stephen mostly works on planning and conducting research studies, as well as facilitating relationships between industry, academics, and the government. And his main areas of research have focused on bulk distribution and remote community planning and operation, and as well as renewable energy integration, distributed flexibility, storage, and grid modernization. So come on up. The green one.
Afternoon. So in this this part here, we took the opportunity to compare two different scenarios. This is going to focus on the two different scenarios, the business as usual case and the net zero case. And the purpose of this analysis was to kind of look at common pathways, the different pathways, and if they're different, why they were different. And you'll see throughout this presentation why I think there is a necessity to have not only different sensitivities, but different models because the results, well, can vary quite a bit. In the business as usual case, it's no emissions limit, no clean electricity regulations, a federal carbon price, and the coal phase out. In the net zero case, we have a declining emissions limit as you see in the table. So we took from the Canada Energy Regulators, not the other CER, and we took that number and we looked at what was the national emissions limit attributed to the electricity sector. And as you can see, it goes from 27 down to minus 35. And that negative 35 megatons CO2 equivalent was essentially due to BECCS. But all but one of the models did not model that negative emissions technology. So we assumed a negative, we took that contribution to the negative emissions from BECCS and removed it, and that's the middle line there. So all the models had to essentially adhere to the, on the right-hand side, basically the national emissions limit without the negative emissions technology. And so that goes from 27 and then hovers between 4 and 5 up to 2050. So the first thing that you will notice in terms of emissions is that, yes, we can achieve net zero. All the pathways that we had did achieve the emissions targets. However, looking at the left-hand side, the business as usual case, you can see that we all started from very different places. With a lot of emissions hovering around, let's say in 2050, towards the 80 megatons, with some down to about 45. But regardless of where the starting point was, for the net zero case, by 2035, all the scenarios were achieving what was requested, no more, no less. I forgot to mention earlier on that with the business as usual and the net zero case that we're analyzing, we wanted to look at the impact on transmission. So we looked at 2 cases with each, so a combination of 4. The first, we looked at a case where transmission was existing and it would just stay that way, no more transmission would be added. And then we looked at a scenario where the transmission was unconstrained and the models could add as much transmissions as they wanted, given the assumptions on the cost of transmission, the losses of transmission, et cetera. What you will notice on the graph on the left here is that there was only a small cost benefit across all the models. So basically for each year between, let's say, 2035 and 2050, about $1 billion per year benefit. I mean, I say small, 1 billion is not small, but it's relatively small given that we're looking at in excess of, well, between 40, 45, and 100 billion per year. However, given we were expecting transmission to have a little bit more impact there, but we did not model other benefits, including those from reliability, emissions, et cetera. They weren't explored. Maybe if I can go back one slide here. I just wanted to point out that on the left-hand side, you do see 2 parts on emissions. You see like a shaded purple area, shaded red area, a top line and a red line. Sorry, a top line and a bottom line for each color. And that denotes that one's transmission and one's transmission constrained and one's transmission unconstrained. So that is to say, in the business as usual case, having open transmission does have some benefit to emissions reduction. What is the impact of net zero on total costs here? On the right-hand side, you see the chart for every year, 2021 to 2050, in groups of 4, and you see kind of a pairing. So every model has constrained and unconstrained net zero benefits. And maybe while there's a lot of colors there, the main thing that you can pay attention to is the blue, and the blue is capacity cost, capacity associated cost, infrastructure cost, capital cost. The rest of it is the operational cost, fuel, operational maintenance, et cetera. So first of all, note that there's a wide variation in total cost projections, and the net zero cost the cost of net zero varies between 3 to 18 billion. And in all cases, new capacity costs make up over about half of the total cost. So one thing you note, and I've kind of said before, is that there's no common pathways the pathways are not all that common. There are similarities between the two. The first would be to note that, and here I'm showing total generation capacity in 2050 using constrained transmission, looking at the different generation capacities. Wind is in green. So we note that wind plays a large role in all models. So in the net zero case, doesn't matter which model we use, wind is quite present, followed by existing hydro, which is the blue, and a little bit of solar, more or less. Flexibility, so the ability of the power system to generate more or less power to meet demand, is likely achieved through a combination of clean combustion, so renewable natural gas with CCS, so biofuels, and storage. So the red there is the fossil fuel gas, the combustion, which again is through biofuels or other type resources. Where we don't have a lot of combustion, we might have more storage, and that's the purple portion that you would see. And reflecting the capacity of the system supply for every year going from 2035 to 2050. And I'll note again that there are significant quantities of combustion. So even though we are striving for a net zero case, we can't get away from combustion. So which brings us to some of the kind of key takeaways. So the first one is that the net zero scenarios are possible. There's marginal agreement in business as usual and net zero pathways, but there are many different ways to get there. So if you can't get there from one direction, perhaps you can get there from another. As an example, maybe going back here, we had seen some cases that have lots of combustion, but there's at least one in the NATEM case, there wasn't very much combustion at all, and it managed to achieve the net zero needs without using combustion resources. And combustion is still substantial, but with biofuels and carbon capture. From a next steps point of view, as you heard in session 1, biofuels, biogas, they are a resource that can be used in multiple areas. It can be used in industry, it can be used in electricity, it can be used for residential heating, but it's also a limited resource. And I think for future directions, our two working groups can work together a little bit more to figure out, well, where best can we use this limited resource? Because we can't say we're going to use all of it in electricity and all of it for industry. There's a limited amount. So a little bit more, some coordination there, and then maybe we can come up with some really good multi-sectoral results of where things should go. And finally, in our models, we did not use any direct-to-air capture, direct air capture means, but we know that these types of direct air capture does use a lot of electricity, a lot of energy as well, and that will, of course, increase load and will have additional impacts in the final result. Yep.
Great. So next up we have Mislav, who is an energy systems modeler at ESMIA, where he specializes mostly in power systems modeling, but also market analysis and energy policies. And he is responsible for NATEM Power and ESMIA's long-term power systems model, as well as linking tools between different energy systems models. Before joining ESMIA, Mislav served as the Deputy Counselor for Nuclear Energy at the French Embassy in the US, and as an Operations Research Engineer at Électricité de France, or EDF. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So yeah, in my part, we are going to talk about a comparison between the two sets of scenarios. The first set, as you can see on the right, is going to be the business as usual, business as usual, with the following current policy: federal carbon price, coal phase out starting from 2030, and with no like emission limit. We have the like other set of scenario, which is the scenario CER, and both sets have two, I would say, like scenarios inside. As we said like before, I would say like constrained like transmission and unconstrained. To model the CER, we have agreed on those like parameters. So the year that the CER goes into effect is 2035. The unit emission limit is calculated by taking what we call like, I would say like a performance standard of 65 tons per gigawatt hour. We also allow offset of 27 tons per gigawatt hour. We also allow cooling, but not any peaker provision. The end of proposed life is like 25 years. So that was for the CR parameters. And as we run those scenarios, we notice that when we compare the two sets of scenarios, business as usual and the CER scenarios, we notice that the total capacity increase for all of Canada under CER. This is mainly due to the fact that a lot of gas plants are being like retired, and most of the I would say capacity is mainly composed of renewable energy, which is wind and solar. Wind for, I would say, the most part. And since those have a lower, I would say, availability factor, you have to build more of them. Also, what we notice is that for two lines, Alberta to British Columbia and Alberta to Saskatchewan, we saw a trend, I would say a general trend across all models, that this line have this capacity increase over the year in the two sets of scenarios, business as usual and CER. So this is the I would say capacity for the transmission line Alberta to British Columbia, and this is the same capacity throughout the years for Alberta to Saskatchewan. And as we can see, it will increase across many models. We think that what is driving that is that the increased renewable energy, especially in I would say Alberta. There are a lot of colors on this graph, but what you really want to look at is the green and yellow, which is wind and solar. And what we can see is that across all models, we found the general trend that wind, especially in Alberta, is going to play a huge role. On the cost side, we see that not all models are fully, I would say, aligned on cost, and this is mainly due to, I would say, assumption. Most of the models see a total cost increase under CER policy, but we see a decrease in fuel cost as well in VO and M cost. And this is mainly due to the fact that we have more renewable energy and less gas, especially in Alberta. We also see that carbon price decrease under CER, that carbon price associated cost decrease under CER policy. On the, I would say, emission side, we see that CER is effective at reducing emission, but it is clearly not enough to reach net zero levels. As you may notice, we already see a trend of reducing emission before the year that CER goes into effect, so 2035. And this is because most of the models have perfect foresight. So you have to prepare for the CER that goes into effect in 2035 by starting to reduce their emission before. When we model transmission, we had, I would say, a bit of a surprise on all the models. The way we model transmission, we didn't see major difference between the, I would say, like unconstrained and constrained scenarios under CER policy or not. Actually, on the, I would say, total capacity, it doesn't make a huge difference, as you can see. So on the, I think, production side, not a huge difference. And on also like total cost, we don't see actually any difference. And that is because maybe we didn't completely model the right way, and we didn't, as like Steven said before, we didn't assess the impact of I would say reliability on the cost of like transmission. So what are the key takeaways from this study? We see that most models, like if not all, have a total capacity increase under CER policy, and most of the, I would say, capacity increase is due to wind and a bit less to solar. We see a transmission capacity increase for the line Alberta to British Columbia, as well for the line Alberta to Saskatchewan. And this is mainly due to the fact that in Alberta, renewable energy is going to play a big role. We also see an increase in total costs under CER policy, but a decrease in fuel cost and variable and operation and maintenance costs. And as you may notice before, some models have more nuclear than others in their model, in their, I would say, like result. I think this is mainly due to the fact how you model flexibility of a nuclear power plant, but also a huge, I would say, a huge factor is that we did not completely align on the variable renewable energy capacity factor assumption. And I think that's the perfect transition from Cameron, because that will be his topic right now. And as you will see, this will make like a big difference. Okay, thank you very much.
So next up we have Cameron, but before doing that, I just want to remind you, if you have questions, to please put them up on the Slido, and also to go onto the Slido and vote for the one for the questions that you think are most interesting, because we'll pull from that, but we'll also pull questions from the room. So next up we have Cam, who is the founder and principal of Setubra Research, which is a consultancy specializing in power system and integrated energy systems modeling. There he works with governments, utilities, independent power producers, and NGOs across North America. And he often collaborates with academics to develop advanced models that support specific aspects of the energy transition. So Cam has experience both in this model comparison exercise as well as similar ones in the US. And his analysis on hydrogen tax credits was recently cited by 13 US senators, which is pretty exciting. So the floor is yours, Cam.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So yeah, as kind of prompted, I'm going to talk about how each of our models are modeling wind and solar and how that might be driving some of those large differences that we're seeing in the model outputs. The structure of this might be a little bit different than Mislav and Steven's talk, in that I'm going to be kind of talking on how you might model, like the methodology on how you might model in VREs or variable renewable energies. And then at the end, we'll kind of take it back and say, okay, well, having done this differently, can this be used to explain some of those kind of divergent outcomes? As a real quick motivation, you know, on the left, this is the NREL-NERA study, which was a really, really well done study looking at kind of Canada's power system transition up to 2050. And this is just to prompt us to think about, yeah, we're going to expect to see a lot of wind and quite a bit of solar online come 2050. And that's something that, you know, as you've been seeing, that our model is kind of consistent with. And so, there's a bit of a motivation for us is, okay, well, we better think carefully about how we model those resources in these capacity expansion models. Because in the past, historically, these haven't been, say, as important of resources. And so maybe there hasn't been as much effort expended on representing those resources in these models. And so we're sort of, shifting towards weather-based systems, and we need to think about how to properly characterize those in our models. Well, what do we know about wind and solar resources? And I'll focus on wind, but it's largely similar takeaways for solar resources. And what we do know is that their system value really depends on when and where they generate. We know that there's spatial diversity is nice. It smooths their output. That's easier to deal with. And we know that their correlation with demand or their must-take resources also really drives their output, correlation to spot prices, stuff like this. And there's some nice studies. The one on the left is from Lucas Swan and Nat Pierre at Dal, looking at these attributes of the wind resource in Atlantic Canada. But they look at it in isolation and provide these layer maps to kind of allow us to think about how those might interact. But what capacity expansion models are really great at is just kind of endogenizing all of that. We've got the temporal aspects if we include them. We've got the spatial aspects if we include them. Let's let the model figure out just how valuable those resources are. However, that's contingent on the spatial and the temporal resolution of the models. So I'll really quickly touch on different types of temporal representations within capacity expansion models. Maddie has already kind of outlined this, but for the subannual kind of operational problems, there's different ways you can slice up a year to model those operational decisions. At the top level, you can use time slices, which more or less break up the year into 16 or to 20-ish time slices that might reflect kind of seasonal differences and intraday differences. And this is what the NATIM model is doing with 16 time slices. Two of our models, UVic and the NRCan model, are using this notion of representative days, whereby you kind of have your own method to select a set of days that are deemed representative of the full year. You weight them accordingly, and then you model those days at hourly dispatch resolution. And then you can go all the way down to just kind of brute forcing it and modeling every hour of the year, and that's what HEC and Setubra is doing in this exercise. On the right-hand side, I just wanted to quickly mention that, we talk a lot about the benefits and the system value of wind and solar, but they also impose a lot of challenges to the system, and those can be captured in the value as well. Bringing them down, right? So there's increased ramping constraints. There's more hours of very low load, which can pose difficulties for other balancing assets and so on. And so to be able to incorporate that, we also need kind of spatial and temporal resolution. Okay, now kind of briefly touching on the spatial side of that spatiotemporal, where as Maddie outlined, each of our models is more or less modeling it at regional, like provincial resolution for many of the resources and for the demand. However, it's possible to sort of have another raster level above that at which you model, say, wind or solar or hydro resources. And those can be spatially explicit. And so some common approaches of how folks are modeling kind of that second layer of wind and solar resources is on the top here, we have kind of a stylized approach whereby a modeler might assume, okay, well, if I'm going to build new wind or new solar, I'm just going to assume it has the same characteristics as the existing wind and solar because we have that data. You can kind of go beyond that and do some regional aggregation whereby you say, okay, in this province, we're going to define 5 regions and each of those will have their own wind and solar regime to characterize some spatial variability. Or you can go to, what I'm calling fully spatially explicit, but it's, there's really no end to the spectrum, is when you use high resolution gridded data from kind of global reanalysis data sets like ERA5 or MERA2, some of you might be familiar with, that really provide kind of really granular, both spatially and temporally data over decades of years with wind speeds, solar insolation, hydro runoff, stuff like this. And you can couple that with some pre-processing tools to characterize the wind and solar resources. And the big plot up top is essentially NREL data showing average wind speeds at 110 meter hub height across Canada. And this is just to show us that there's a lot of variability across the country. Representing that would be good. And this will also, to some of our earlier points, maybe highlight the value of interregional transmission so that you can kind of build in the windy areas and supply it to those areas that might not be so windy. Now, this is just kind of a quick example of what Setubra's model is doing in terms of characterizing the wind and solar resource. in this case, Alberta. So on the left, we've plotted, say, the LCOE of wind in 2030. And we can see that, the yellower it is, the cheaper it is, the better the resource. And this has to do with a resource strength, but also proximity to the existing transmission network, because spur line costs, well, they do cost things to interconnect, right? So being close to the network helps. In the middle is just a quick display of that. We can also layer in other considerations. So this is some work showing that, trying to quantify where you can build, in this case, solar, and how much of it might you be able to build in each grid cell. So you can kind of put in resource constraints. And on the right, we have the LCOE of solar resources. Once we've stripped out the grid cells that we say you can't build there because there's water, there's built environment, there's farmland, there's, you can, protected, conserved sites, stuff like this. Okay, so pulling it back to the MMCF context, we've already kind of briefly summarized what the models are doing temporally. Now to quickly go over how folks or how groups are doing the VRE spatial representation. As Maddie sort of mentioned, a lot of the group is using data from coders, which is this grid cell data. But what we're seeing is that folks have different approaches on kind of aggregating that to, say, a highly stylized or sub-regional. And so Copper uses full grid cell, so like the fine resolution. NATEM takes the coder's data, aggregates it into several resource groups per region or per province. Pithos has one, solar and one wind resource per region based off coder's data. In PIPESA, NRCan has one resource per province, and what they do is they use the grid cell data, but just select the windiest or the sunniest sites, so to speak. And Tomoa, we just kind of, outlined what that looks like. Okay, so in the last 2 minutes, I'll just kind of quickly try to tie this back to the results. Plotted here is just the capacities of wind and solar. And we see, okay, well, it varies quite a bit across models. Can we explain that at all with the representation of wind and solar? And so quickly, what I've plotted on the left is I've extracted the, say, capacity and the supply data from our models to determine what's the average capacity factor for those resources across the model years. And this is for wind, and we see it varies quite a bit. And so in some of the groups, we see kind of an ascending line, and that reflects that in the early days, it's largely existing wind turbines that have, worse capacity factors. But as we go out, we get some learning from, higher in hub heights and so on, and those capacity factors increase. But there's still a wide spread in overall capacity factors, ranging anywhere from 35% up north of 50. On the right, I've plotted kind of NREL ATB. This is kind of the Bible for a lot of power system modelers. This shows what expected capacity factors are out to 2050 for different wind classes. Canada has a distribution of this, but a lot of it's kind of in the 2 to 5 range. Similar, we get kind of equal variance in solar capacity factors, anywhere in 2050, say from 16% up to 21. So that's a pretty big spread, a pretty big relative spread. And a big difference there is that some groups are modeling solar with one axis tracking, and some groups consider fixed mounted solar. So that there's a pretty big difference there in terms of what capacity factors those can get you. Similarly, on the right is the NREL ATB solar capacity factor by class. And us being in Canada and this being an American resource, our sort of resource class is near the bottom of that. Okay, so second to last slide. This is just a picture that is just kind of prompting us to say, well, modeling these things spatially explicitly, it allows for kind of further considerations and iterations for modelers and modelers working with stakeholders. This shows, I think, for the business as usual case, in Tomoa, where do we build wind and where do we build solar? And so this allows us to say all of a sudden, well, hey, should we constrain some of those sites? Those seem a little bit wonky. Maybe we should, restrict those. Should we add more cost factors? Like, is it sensible to build wind up in Brandon or wherever that is in Manitoba? It probably costs a lot to get things up there, or maybe there's a port. I have no idea. It can motivate modeling more intra-provincial grid constraints, which we're not doing in this exercise. And we can maybe start to extract some considerations for more regional economic impacts like labor force implications and so on. So to sum this all up, we have here that optimal wind and solar capacities exhibit a really wide intermodal variance, say between Copper and Tomoa. but across scenarios within the same model, they're fairly tight. And so we can attribute those differences likely to the kind of structural differences in the model and how we represent space and time. And then, post hoc analyses such as this multi-model comparison forum are really, really helpful in identifying those structural and parametric differences between models and in determining where improvements can be made. So I think, yeah, we've all learned a lot from this. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Cam. So next we have Pascal, who leads the modeling and analysis for regulatory support in the Energy and Transportation Division at Environment and Climate Change Canada. And so Pascal has been working a lot in this group on the clean electricity regulations over the past few years. And before joining ECCC in 2020, Pascal worked in life cycle assessment at CREG. So over to you, Pascal.
Okay, thank you very much. So my talk will be a little bit more like Cameron's in the sense that I won't be showing any results. I'll be talking really more about methodology and the scope of approaches that could have been taken to model US trade and what the different groups did. First, I wanted to show some historic data. Now, the historic data might not be a good representation of what's going to happen in the future, but what we see here are exports, imports, and the resulting net imports for 18 years, pulled out of from Statistics Canada data. And you see that, first of all, some provinces export a lot. So you can see Quebec and Ontario really standing out over here, as well as Manitoba. You can see British Columbia being a net importer or net exporter, depending on the year, which is, of course, interesting in the way that it operates as to balance its load and its neighbors. And then others that look like they're not trading much. But of course, this is in absolute amounts. I'm going to be showing later how this can be looked at in terms of fraction of the load for each province. But I'm going to be coming back to this graph over and over again and putting where each team ended up on for trade and laying it on top of this graph. So the different approaches that a group or model can take to model trade with the US for a Canadian model, but it can also relate to how you would model another province if you have a model specific to one province. So how you're going to model Manitoba and Quebec if you're modeling Ontario, for example. And so the easiest approach, of course, is islanding, in the sense that you don't assume any trade and you just look at how the province or the country itself can meet its own demands. Then you can do what most people did within this modeling comparison work, which is fixed hourly trade. Basically, we have data that was in the quoters database and said, at this hour of the year, this is how much Quebec exports to the United States. Excuse me. You could also use data like that to fix the yearly trade, but then allow the model to endogenously decide when to do that trade. We've worked with models like that in the past. You can also represent the US as a marginal technology, basically determining what it would cost to displace electricity generation there or to buy electricity that's generated there. You can have a simplified US market, a simplified US fleet, and of course, you can also integrate all of the United States within your model. So as you go down in that list, you're adding more and more computational burden, but you're also allowing a lot more flexibility, a lot more freedom to your model to identify interesting results. So what did the different groups do? We have one group that did islanding, was PIPSA Canada, 3 that did the recommended approach of using the fixed hourly trade, so the Copper, Pithos, and Timoa model. Then Nathan used a simplified US market approach. We sort of participated in this approach in this modeling comparison. We didn't show any results today, but we used a simplified US fleet approach, and I will be describing how that works. Nobody used a full US sector model or a marginal technology or fixed yearly trade. Okay, so islanding. You're not trading with the US at all. Maybe that's a good representation of what's coming with, who knows. But what you will do is you basically, if you do that, it's not possible to use international trade for balancing. You can't, and most provinces are net exporters. That's why it's bolded in black. You would underestimate the generation that's required because you're no longer generating for export. And you're probably overestimating your total cost too, because you're not considering the revenues that could be generated from this export. For net importers, well, then you're overestimating the generation, but you're probably also overestimating costs because you're not taking into account that you can import cheaper electricity when it makes sense to do so. So of course, when you're islanding, I put here the potential scale of issues. It's the same graph that I showed before, but scale to the demand that we were using in 2021. And so where you had some provinces that seemed to be very close to the zero mark, all of a sudden they stand out a lot more. One example here is Manitoba. It can be up to about 40% of its load is exported. It can be even higher than that. You have some provinces that you couldn't even see before, such as New Brunswick, and all of a sudden, 10 to 20% of its load being exported. So these are significant numbers for sure for some provinces. So this is the scale of how off you could be, assuming again that historical data is a good representation of trade in the future. Then with the fixed hourly trade, again, it's not possible to use international trade for balancing. So that's a limitation that you're imposing on your model. The other thing too is there may be a mismatch between the timing of trade that you're imposing on your model on the one hand, and the residual load profiles and the marginal prices on the other. So I did a quick correlation analysis for the different provinces between the load and trade, and basically not correlated. So that may be an issue as well that that one needs to consider. And of course, there's the risk of choosing data for an unrepresentative year. Here I show the data that was used, that's in encoders, and how it fits in the different box plots that I've been showing. So for example, for Manitoba, it really stands out. It seems to be for a year where the net exports are rather low. And so you're probably, if you're using coders for this, underestimating the amount of trade that needs to be done. So underestimating the generation that Manitoba needs to do. On the whole, though, if you look at Canada, it looks to be spot on. So that's great. That's what, but yeah. Then there's an approach that Nathan took, well, that SMEA took with their Nathan model. So what they did is they ran another model, the Nathan USA model, outside of this project. And from that, they were able to gather hourly marginal cost of generation for the US regions that trade with Canadian provinces, and basically allow Canadian provinces to purchase or sell electricity at that cost. The only limit to the volume of electricity that could be traded is based on the capacity of the transmission line itself, not on how much generation can actually happen in those provinces, well, in the States. So that would be one limitation. But other than that, this gives much more flexibility. Here I showed data for 2 years, 2021 and 2030, sometimes directly aligning with the historical, sometimes not so much. So, but again, this is the future. Who knows where we will end up? But when we look at 2021, mostly the data aligns with the historical, but not always, as we can see, for example, for Quebec or Ontario. And then there's the approach that we developed at ECCC. So my team and I, I'm going to name it, so Jenny is right there. There's Alex Robertson. We worked on this approach, and we worked on it with HSA, actually, Pierre-Olivier Pinault and Artelis, who are here. Actually, I'm not sure if Artelis is here. They are? Great. All right. So what we did is basically we made sure that we could get results from a US model, sort of like SMEA did with Nathan, but not our model. It would be, so we use the NREL Cambium model that has a lot of scenarios baked in, like that they ran and they provided data for. And so we took that information and we developed some scripts that can simplify the US regions and calculate the residual load that's coming from all of these different scenarios, from which we include just a residual US fleet. So everything that is VRE, must run, even nuclear is excluded. We only have the rampable, dispatchable fleet left, which makes it very, very small. And so we can include it directly in the model without overburdening the computational step of model resolution. So it makes trade endogenous. And when you look at where we ended up in 2021 and 2030, using the same years that I showed for the SMEA model, I see that for New Brunswick, we're falling right in. But for others, when you look, for example, for Manitoba, there's way too much export one year and then way too many imports the other. So it definitely changes year over year. If I look here, so I know there's a lot of lines, but the blue are imports, the red are exports, and the net would be the green. And you can see definitely how things evolve over time, which would indicate that these systems want to evolve over time. And so using something static in your model would prevent this and sort of force your model in some solution space that might not be completely optimal. So coming back to this slide, this is my last one. So you have a bunch of approaches. They run from very easy to somewhat to more complicated, both in terms of complexity and computational burden. Given more flexibility, what we see is that the models will use trade with the US to reduce their cost and to more efficiently balance their load. And there are ways to keep things computationally light if you do like if you front load the work. So for example, we front loaded the work at ECCC by writing all of the scripts that would pull in the results of people who put months and months and months of work modeling the US. SMEA needs to run their whole native US model. So yes, that takes a lot of work, but once it's done, and then you have a simplified representation of the US that's easily integratable in the model. So that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Pascal. So last but not least, we have Michelle doing a wrap up and some next steps, kind of pulling it all together, our learning. Michelle is a full professor in the Department of Decision Sciences at HEC Montreal, where his areas of expertise include financial engineering, risk management, energy derivatives, and environmental finance. He's also involved in the chair in energy sector management at HEC Montreal, where he collaborates on research projects, including those focusing on computational energy and environmental analysis. Come on up.
Thank you, Madeline. So there are disadvantages to speaking last and advantages. Some of I didn't ask to be last, but I'll come back to dictatorship in a second. Disadvantages are that all the cute colored graphs have been shown. All the interesting things have been said already. So I'm left with less to say. The advantage is that you get to thank people. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank the people from UVic, the CSIT group, for making this collaboration possible. Especially few people I want to mention, Devin Azevedo, I don't know where he is, over there, hiding. Madeleine Seattle especially, and Jonas Krach, who led this thing with Master. It's very difficult to get industry people to do something below cost. It's also very difficult to get academics to do anything at all. Civil servants are somewhere between. But they did manage. They struck a balance, I'd say, between democratic debate and benevolent dictatorship. And they did it very well. So my thanks to you and my hat off. In any case, whoever's hiring them, keep your eyes on them because you don't want to find them on someone else's payroll. So, oh yes, I'm supposed to have. Yeah. Okay. The achievements so far. Well, I think the best achievement we've done is building this community. People are there in good faith. It's nobody's main job. It's everybody's. It's a pet project, but people do put their heart into it. We've seen convergence on many things. At one end, the quarters database that people are using. At the other end, the IDEA software that help us at but we do actually, I should say, certainly spend quite a few hours looking at things and thinking, okay, this model is doing that. Why is it doing that? What is happening? So we have a high level of convergence, either full convergence or high level convergence on many of the inputs. And well, there's patterns, at least for the overall cost. Not everybody gets the same cost, but when we don't land in the same place, we have an idea why. This is, I guess, the most important thing. I won't be long. If you're yearning for your third coffee of the day, I won't take the full 10 minutes. What are the next steps? We can improve alignment. We can deal on some of the things like the greenhouse gases reduction, the inputs. We all have the same basic inputs, but right off the bat, some of us change the inputs. We do averages because as I say, we do averages on some of the inputs because we don't have fine zonal resolution, for example. International trade, we didn't all model the same thing. But I would say one of the two main directions in which we're about to go is getting more resolution. So as a nod to what people did this morning, zonal resolution, so that we can account for the distribution problems that are looming on a short horizon. Temporal resolution, so we can manage those peaks. We're all in hourly resolution, but not everybody's accounting for all hours. But oh, I thought it was mine. So we're expanding models. This is with respect to inputs. With respect to technology, I think, especially for someone coming from more of a mathematical programming point of view, seeing that we're all brute forcing linear programming on these models is a bit surprising. So this is some place where we're going, certainly with the models having better temporal and zonal resolution. The models are just becoming too big. So decomposition and other techniques like reinforcement learning are coming our way. So this is another direction where we're going. We want to keep the beauty of diversity. So we always have this equilibrium to find. We don't want to agree on everything. We don't want to agree on the basics, but then we want to keep the diversity so that we can end up with different results and understand why. I think this is one of the richness that we want to keep in this small group. And I want to finish this with a call. I'm calling it a call for provincial interest, but it could be regional or city. We're making nice things. We're doing a pan-Canadian picture, taking into account a full pan-Canadian picture, something that provincial utilities or regional organizations don't necessarily do. So it's possible for us to find out places where bipartite or multipartite win-win situations exist. So if there are provincial, regional players willing to come on board, I think this is one ingredient that may be missing from our community right now to make sure that our research doesn't just end up being that research, but that it has gets some traction, some adherence, and gets implemented. So if you have some willingness to come on board, please join us. If you have questions you'd like to be cracked open, well, you can ask them right now, but of course you can email us later on, and we can take that into account. And I said I would finish in less than 10 minutes, and this is done. Thank you.
Pre-order. Oh, no. Unless you want some. So, and so you can see there a link there. All of our results are up on the IDEA platform through that link there. So you're welcome now if you'd like, but don't get too distracted because we still have a 20 or 30 minutes for Q&A. But if you want to poke around on the results yourself, you can log on to the website there and see some of the results. So we'll turn it over to Q&A. I've got some here on the Slido, but I'll also take questions in the room if you want to line up in the room. The first one I think is an easy one. I'm going to toss it to Maddie. 16 votes on this one, so a popular question. Why the different starting points in 2020?
Yeah, it did jump out on the graphs that the 2021 results there was some variability there. Some of it was just an issue in reporting. It's not all models had 2021 inputs as listed as results in the model. For the most part, there was alignment across several categories in terms of generation capacity and transmission capacity in the 2021 results, but there were obviously slight discrepancies just based on model parameterization and different availabilities of generation technologies within each model. So we're, as mentioned and reiterated several times on input alignment, we're always striving to improve that. So for the most part, it was pretty good, even though it might not have looked it, I suppose.
Okay, so then this next one, I think we can start with Cam, but I think maybe it'd be nice to hear from all of the modeling teams. Was land availability considered as an input regarding the availability of wind and solar? If so, was that one of the parameters that could be agreed upon? So maybe Cam, yeah, you could start with an overview, but if any of the modelers have something to add.
Yeah, sure. Good question. So yeah, it's probably good to hear from more than just me, because I can speak to what I've done, but I can't really speak to the others. I guess that's a short way of saying, no, that's not something that we agreed on or even spoke about. But for my work, as you saw in the middle when there was 3 charts, I did a cursory job kind of extracting land availability from some data sets and didn't allow solar, say on, in water or on farmland or built environment. But you can also, I'm not a GIS professional, but it's certainly possible to kind of integrate a whole bunch of layers and set, say, setbacks or distances, or look at inclines, for wind development and so on. So I did it at, in a medium level, can always be improved upon, but it's not something that we really even spoke about as a group, but I'm not sure if others are, can provide an answer.
I can provide the answer for what data was available in coders and what was considered in the copper model. As Cam mentioned in his presentation, in coders, there was merit to grid cell data for wind and solar capacity factors, and each of those grid cells had an associated land availability number associated with it. This is definitely something that we are looking to update shortly. So there is a certain amount of land constraints within the coders data, but not, I don't think, to the level that Cam had representation. So that was considered in copper, but what, as mentioned, was not necessarily agreed upon as a key input parameter for all the models, though that will likely change going forward. I don't know if any of the other models considered grid cell land. Yeah.
Okay, we'll take one from the room now, please.
Thank you so much. My name's Red. I'm a casual worker at NRK, and I'm also doing my PhD at Queen's. And my question, I think the panel can answer, but specifically to Cam, because I hope he can help with my research. In wind power, as you said, you're looking at spatial and temporal resolutions. But one of the challenges we're facing is whenever in my research, I'm looking at local kind of wind and solar and energy mixes, and then I'll do some LCA modeling where I can take maybe help from Pascal next year. But when we go into temporal resolutions, even to a week or a day, until we take the variations, the weather varies drastically day to day. There are times when it might be fully overcast or it might be below the cut-in speed. So how are you taking that into account? Does the granularity of each day kind of factor that into the model? And if not, if we are adding that as a raster, the challenge is that we have data for different points in the map, but not over an area. So is there a way that you are addressing that? And I'm hoping that can, help me in my own research as well. Thank you.
Thanks for the question, and I wish I had a better answer for you and your research. But I mean, we're doing some things there. We're using hourly resolution, so we do lose a lot of, particularly with solar, like cloud cover. Kind of, you probably want kind of minute or 15-minute resolution. So you can certainly downscale. I know there's some methods out for both spatial and temporal downscaling, but there's always trade-offs. Do we want to run a full year at 15-minute intervals is a separate question. But we do hourly, and with wind, variability tends to be kind of above that. Yeah, I mean, that's as best as I can answer. It's just hourly. Oh, that's the other thing I was going to mention is that we do account for kind of wake losses with wind farms, because right now when you're modeling it, you typically have like a power curve for an individual wind turbine, but since we're building them at scale, we do a bit of modeling to account for kind of turbulence losses, wake losses, things like this. But yeah.
Anybody else want to jump in on that? Okay, we'll go back to Slido. So most of these models have some kind of perfect foresight. Do we have any examples of less optimal pathways? For example, taking into account political or imperfect choices? And if so, what are the total cost differences, or do the costs look much different?
I mean, I guess maybe unfortunately head this one off at the pass in that we didn't take into account like non-optimal scenarios, at least for these optimization models. I believe CAMS is myopic and the rest of them have perfect foresight. But in general, optimization models tend to have to be scenario-based to consider kind of non-optimal solutions. So we would have needed to vary the input parameters that we had selected. It's definitely something going forward. We're eager to hear what the larger community at whole would like to see, what kind of scenarios would like to be run, because as we improve our alignment, the next step, I suppose, is looking at more interesting scenarios. So it's definitely something we can design in the future, but I don't think we have any results that speak to those right now, unless people do individually.
Hello. Just a bit of publicity for some of the work we do. Since the question was asked. So it is possible. We do some uncertainty modeling, but it's just to say that with good resolution and pan-Canadian, we're not doing it in this forum just because the models become too big. We need other techniques to solve the problem. But we did a 3-step expansion, for example, where we take into account some uncertainty. And again, there's other techniques that allow you, but in the current, it was not relevant for this forum for us to do that.
I was going to say also unintentionally, I think as a group, we've discovered areas that reflect that we weren't able to come up with those uncertainty, where those uncertainties kind of came up. One example would be representative days and translating to 8760s. Sometimes the 8760s didn't work the way we thought it did because those representative days weren't representative. As well as when you're choosing representative days, they should be based off the amount of solar and wind and demand response, et cetera, that you're going to be choosing that you anticipate you're going to be choosing, but you don't know what you're going to be choosing until you run the model based off the representative days that depends on the days that you've chosen. So things to work out.
Yeah, and then I quickly add to that too. So there's, I'm sure, many methods to sort of assess that question, but one method that's kind of been gaining some popularity in research is an uncertainty method called modeling to generate alternatives. And I'll maybe spend 30 seconds describing what that is, because it's a really nice way to kind of explore non-cost optimal, but nearly cost optimal pathways. And so what you can do is you run the model just like we did. You figure out what's the total system cost. And then we start to generate kind of a scenario tree off that. But those scenarios, instead of minimizing cost, you then put a cost constraint. So you say, okay, well, any outcome can only be marginally more expensive than the least cost solution, 1%, 5%, whatever you say. And then you can start to play around with the updated objective function or search directions to say, find me a bunch of maximally different pathways that are all within this kind of cost premium. And then you can, look at that, portfolio of results and say, oh, look at this one, or oh, look at that one, and look at kind of non-cost solutions that might really vary across things that we can't model, other KPIs, I guess.
Okay, great. We'll go to Normand.
Normand Mousseau, from Director of the Institut de l'Énergie Trottier and co-director of the EMH. Very nice work. Now, I've seen you at work. It's really remarkable the amount of dedication they had for the last year to work together. So congratulations. Looking at the numbers, which were a bit surprising to me, how disparate is, yeah. The numbers were for the utility factors. Brought me to the question about resiliency. I mean, can we think of putting kind of resiliency factors in building this electricity network? The sense that if you don't have wind for 10 days, what do you do? If you don't have sun for a month, which happens sometimes, what do you do? So are there ways of optimizing a network over years while including these things? And is it something that could be in the scenarios you're developing?
I think one part of this answer is how really precise you are going to model the, I would say, hydropower. Because right now we don't have any long-term like storage, and the only I would say like inter maybe like seasonal storage is big hydro dam. And I don't think like in this group we model all the same way the hydro dam, but that could definitely be something that we can align on and see what are the difference between if you model hydro one way and if you model hydro the other way, what is going to be the difference in renewable energy, in like resilience and all of that. But I think that's just part of the answer.
I think a really easy step would be to run, following our results, what you would call the probabilistic reliability adequacy studies. And there are tools out there, I think by NREL, that you can put your results into and see what your expected outages are, expected chance of outages are, and if some numbers pop up that don't quite fit with what you expect or what you want, then it becomes that iterative approach to develop your capacity.
Yeah, and just building off what Stephen said is I mean, there are resource adequacy constraints in these models. It's planning reserve margin and so on. These aren't perfect, but they're a proxy for it. But the other thing I would say is that these models tend to overfit for the weather year that you give it, and we only did a single weather year. And so one fairly easy solution is to run these over a decade or several decades of weather years, so you have more exposure to those kind of wind doldrums and no sun events, so that you can plan for that.
Echoing what Stephen and Cam said, there's ways that this definitely can be done, like NREL's PRAS tool we've run after copper before to assess the outage probabilities and stuff like that. But and potentially people more clever than me will be able to integrate some of those within the capacity expansion models, but likely this will require either multiple model runs or an additional model being run after the fact on the given electricity systems in order to fully give you a good answer on reliability, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, and I think this is a question that, I mean, Michel kind of raised it in his wrap up. This is one of the directions that we could go as a group to all, for example, run the PRAS model, the NREL PRAS probabilistic resource adequacy model after our scenario runs. That's something that we theoretically could do in the future. And I think at this moment in time where we're at as a group is we have a pretty good workflow now in terms of pulling from coders, visualizing an idea, a good working relationship. And we really are looking a little bit for direction now, like as a group, now that we're somewhat established. Where should we go? Like, is reliability the big question in the room that should be our next step? Or is it something else? Is it integrating new technologies into our model? Or, so I think looking for some feedback there on that. And actually that was one, the reliability one is, I think that's the second time or maybe even third time now that it's been raised. So maybe that is where we go next, but we'll see. Open to suggestions. So the next question on Slido here is, can you explain why under the CER scenario, there's still capacity for fossil fuels in basically all of the models?
I'm assuming neither of the government representatives will want to discuss the CER.
Or maybe not, yeah. So we did not show our model results, and I can't speak to the way that the CR was modeled in any of the other groups. I did not go in, I did not go check. They did not have access to the latest version of the CR has been thought up now. So there are a lot of caveats to preface my answer with, but I think the important thing is the CR does not, everything that's been communicated about the CR does not ban the use of fossil fuels. There are emission limits in the first kind of gazette. It was an intensity-based limit. There was an update that was released almost a year ago where it was said that it would be an annual emission limit based on full capacity. So there are things out there that would indicate that this is not a ban on natural gas or a ban on fossil fuels, and they continue to have a role. And there's a lot of flexibilities that have been proposed, such as pooling, which the different groups here, I don't know if they all succeeded in integrating, but the pooling of emissions across different units, or the annual emission limit across different units, and other flexibilities would allow different paths in different provinces that have different challenges to meeting the different constraints of the CER. And so, yeah, lots of flexibility, not a ban. And so you would not expect every plant to close down due to the CER.
And there's also a distinction to be made between capacity and generation or dispatch, where even if they can't really run at high capacity factors, there are kind of, to Normand's point, reliability standards baked into the model. And so, a lot of cheap gas might sit idle to provide that reliability or those peaking needs. But that begs a second question that we haven't really spoke about is how do you do capacity accreditation under the CER? Do gas plants keep their kind of capacity accreditation, or should they drop because all of a sudden they're on a budget? But
also want to point out the fact that when you see fossil fuel gas, it also includes with CCS. So there's that.
Yeah. Oh, great. We'll turn to you.
I think.
Oh, were you first? Okay, great.
Sure. I don't know whether my question is the right one, but I'm still asking you this following question. In terms of the prices of electricity under net zero, what these models suggest, like what will be the electricity price like compared to the current prices that we have today? Are there some convergence in terms of the output of these models? And yeah, so that's the second question. First, what the price, and is there some convergence? Thank you.
Well, I think you're putting your finger on something we raised yesterday. It's an interesting metric that we're not looking into very much at this point. So the unpleasant answer is we don't know for now.
yeah, I think the best we can do is we can extract kind of wholesale power prices from these models, but it's going to miss a lot of the kind of distribution and interprovincial transmission costs, which we see are kind of growing faster than the cost of electricity, like power. So we there's limited scope there that we can look at.
Is because I am an investor, for example, so I want to invest. If I have a good idea, like, what the modeling results are telling, what's the price, that gives a signal to the investors, right? So I think having that kind of output from this model will help not only as an investor, but also, to convince Canadians that net zero is doable. The price is not going to be very huge, but this is doable. So I would say that it will be nice to have some indication of prices, that's coming out of the model would be a good output.
Maybe that's why we haven't looked at it.
Okay, great.
Great presentation. My question's somewhat related a little bit from the investment point of view. If someone is running a due diligence assessment of a set of modeling outcomes, and that was done with a specific data set and a specific modeling tool, and someone else was to say, how do I validate this? Was there any lessons learned out of this to sort of say, here's how one could run a due diligence analysis of a modeling outcome to sort of really give confidence in an investment decision? And if so, does that lead to a set of best practices?
I suppose, I guess it depends what you mean by due diligence, because in some ways, or validation, because in some ways, having this multimodal comparison forum is its own form of validation. Are numbers in line with each other? Are outcomes looking in line with each other? Or are we talking more due diligence in terms of the input data, in which case coders, we have a process for validation of data, but we're also open to suggestions from the broader community on if there's sources that should be updated or numbers that look a little wonky. So I guess my answer is I'm not sure, because I think it depends exactly what aspect you're talking about. Or if it is a question of something like reliability and are these systems viable, then I think that's been discussed as well. So was there something particular? Maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Yeah, I guess is to give an example, if you're using other modeling tools, you might say, well, this modeling tool has been set against a standard set of defined parameters, so we know it's reliable for this input set, so we can extrapolate off of it. So I'm wondering, in this sense, does that, looking at the different models against each other, was there some sort of way that we can say, here's what the models should converge, or here's the, if you are looking at a set of outputs, how could you validate those externally without using the tool and the data set that was used to produce them, to say, how do we then independently say, well, these results make sense? And I'm wondering if there is, if that would lead us, as what I've seen with other modeling tools, that there's a set of standards that are applied to, if you're making decisions using a modeling tool, here's how the modeling tool must compute, it must converge, here's how we have confidence in it. So I'm just wondering if that is a direction that you started to pick out in terms of doing this comparison to say, yeah, there are best practices, or there's a best way to do this, and here's how we can have confidence in the output of things, or here's a method that if we're looking at results from a modeling output, that we can say, yes, we can be sure that this was done correctly, or that the input data was handled correctly and put in, in a valid way.
Well, just to reinforce on what Maddie said, I think we're building our own benchmarks together. No, we don't have a specific benchmark, outside benchmark. For inputs, certainly, for our team, at least when we see coders' input, we compare that with other inputs we've had in other models, and that serves as a reassurance. But for the outputs, for whatever expansion levels we see, that we compare each other, one to each other, and this is really how we progress and improve.
I'll quickly answer that, maybe answer that question and the last question with another question, in that when we're looking at our work here, we're looking only at the electricity sector, so a single slice of the energy sector. So the question is, how do you attribute the cost to the electricity sector, where if the electricity sector is going to be a backbone of the energy sector, and kind of taking on costs that might not otherwise have been born in a non-net zero scenario, I guess, how do you cost it out? And I'll bring that example back to the biofuels. Even though biofuels might be a cheaper way of achieving net zero, maybe it's better used in another sector, but then where are the costs and where are the benefits that which sector gets that benefit?
Yeah, and the last thing I'd say is some groups, kind of as a means of validation, would say test their model against a commercial model like Plexos that utilities or system operators would use, and you say, okay, well, they're investing billions of dollars from the outcomes of that model, so we'll consider that to be the truth or something, and then you can use that as a baseline. But I don't think it's common practice.
I guess finally, just to add on, I think transparency in the inputs and the outputs is how we're going to get there as well. So we're working an idea to integrate not just the outputs, but also key inputs that can be quickly checked against each other. Again, yeah, checking it against other modeled results or other studies or other models is definitely a way that we can use going forward. But I don't think we've established a set guideline from this forum so far.
Okay, great. I think we will break there now. And so I'd just like to say thank you again to this incredible group, not just for this panel, which was really interesting, but really for a whole year of work and free work. So big round of applause, please, for these modeling groups.